A single request for leftover food should have been insignificant, but for one powerful CEO, it unraveled a reality he was never prepared to face. What he discovered after following his employee home shattered every assumption he had about his company, his wealth, and the people working beneath him. How could he have been so blind? Let us know in the comments, what would you do in his position? Michael Turner never noticed Sophia Bennett before. Not really. She was just one of the countless employees who worked at the headquarters of Turner Hospitality Group, a company he had built from the ground up. In his eyes, she was nothing more than a name in the payroll system, a worker in the background, ensuring that his empire functioned smoothly. Yet now, here she was, standing in front of him in the employee lounge, clutching a neatly folded request form as if her life depended on it. "Leftover food?" he repeated, his brows slightly furrowed as he scanned the paper she had handed him. Sophia nodded, eyes cast downward. "Yes, sir. From the restaurant division. I was told I needed approval for anything outside of standard procedures." Michael leaned back in his chair, still holding the form between his fingers. The request wasn't complicated, just permission to take home unsold food at the end of each night. It wasn't stealing, nor was it unusual for restaurants, under his company's umbrella, to donate excess meals to local shelters. But an employee asking for it? That was new. "Why?" The question came out before he could think twice. Sophia hesitated. It was the slightest pause, but Michael caught it. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured. "I don't want it to go to waste, sir. If no one else is taking it, I thought—" She trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. Michael studied her for a moment. She wasn't wearing the cheap enthusiasm of an employee trying to score points with the boss. Her clothes were neat but slightly faded, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She didn't fidget, but something in her posture felt restrained. He could have approved the request right then. It was easy, a simple signature. But instead he found himself asking, "Where do you live, Sophia?" Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and for the first time he saw hesitation, caution, maybe even embarrassment. "Southridge." Southridge. The name meant little to most people who lived in the polished, glass-filled world of the Turner Hospitality offices, but Michael knew it. It was one of those places tucked away on the city's outskirts, where rent was low and opportunities even lower. His fingers drummed against the desk. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 3 years, sir." 3 years. Long enough to be familiar with company policies. Long enough to know that requesting leftover food was not a standard part of her job. Michael exhaled through his nose, considering his next words. He could have let it go, could have signed the approval and sent her on her way. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. "I'll think about it," he said. Sophia's head snapped up in surprise. "Sir?" "Give me a day," he told her, setting the form aside. "I'll review the policy and get back to you." Sophia nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She muttered a polite, "Thank you, sir," before turning to leave. Michael waited until she was gone before glancing back at the form. A request for leftover food. Something about it gnawed at him. He found himself watching her later that day. Not intentionally, at least, that's what he told himself. It was just that once he noticed her, it became impossible not to. Sophia wasn't the type to linger. She moved efficiently through her tasks, keeping to herself, speaking only when necessary. If he hadn't known better, he would have assumed she was just another office worker with nothing particularly unique about her. But now, every detail felt significant. The way she avoided the vending machines, the way she skipped out on the company-sponsored lunches, the way she checked the time with a subtle urgency, as if she had somewhere to be that was more important than here. And when 5 o'clock hit, she didn't waste a second. Michael stood by his office window, watching as she exited the building and disappeared into the crowd of employees heading home. A thought occurred to him. A ridiculous, unnecessary, completely uncharacteristic thought. He grabbed his coat And then, before he could second-guess himself, he followed her. It was easy to blend in. Sophia walked quickly, her head down, her posture stiff. She wasn't aware of him trailing a few paces behind, nor did she seem to notice anything around her. She moved with purpose, weaving through the busier parts of the city before reaching the outskirts. Southridge wasn't far, but it might as well have been a different world. The sleek office buildings faded into older, more worn-down neighborhoods. The streets weren't unsafe, but they were visibly struggling. Cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, the occasional car that looked like it had seen better days. Michael stayed back, curiosity tightening in his chest. He had followed people before, competitors, business associates, people he suspected were leaking company secrets. But this was different. Sophia finally stopped at a small trailer park on the edge of town. Michael slowed his pace. The home she entered wasn't anything special. It was small, too small for a family, but there was a warmth to it, a flickering light inside that suggested life beyond the peeling paint and rusted metal exterior. He didn't know what he had been expecting, maybe a rundown apartment, maybe something worse, but a trailer? That was something he hadn't seen coming. And then, through the dim glow of the single window, he saw them. Children. 2 younger ones, a girl no older than 10 and a boy who might have been 12. They sat at a rickety wooden table chatting animatedly as Sophia entered. And behind them, in a small rocking chair, an elderly woman with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes. Sophia set down her bag, her expression softening as she bent to speak to them. Michael's fingers curled into his coat pocket. She hadn't asked for food for herself. She had asked for them. And in that moment, Michael Turner, the CEO, the businessman, the man who thought he understood everything about his employees, realized just how little he truly knew. Michael stood there for far too long. The street was quiet, except for the occasional passing car and the hum of a flickering streetlight overhead. He wasn't sure what exactly had rooted him to the spot, but he couldn't bring himself to turn away just yet. Inside the trailer, Sophia moved with careful efficiency, retrieving plates from a narrow cupboard, setting them down with a familiarity that told him this was routine. The children leaned in excitedly as she unpacked a modest amount of food, nothing extravagant, but enough to form a meal. She hadn't noticed him. Not that she should have. He shouldn't be here. Michael clenched his jaw, taking a slow step back. His breath was steady, controlled, but his mind was racing. This didn't make sense. Sophia worked for him. She had worked for him for 3 years. How was it possible that she lived like this? He turned on his heel and walked away. He didn't stop until he was several blocks down, where the glow of the city began to reclaim the streets, making them feel less like forgotten corners of the world. His hands tightened in his pockets, and for the first time in a long time, Michael found himself at a loss for what to do next. It wasn't as if he was naive. He knew not all of his employees were well off. He knew that corporate salaries didn't stretch the same for everyone, that life had different weights for different people. But this was something else entirely. By the time he reached his car, his mind was already forming a plan. The next morning, Michael was in his office earlier than usual. His assistant Devon barely looked up from his desk when he entered. "You're in early," he noted, his tone casual as he sorted through a stack of files. "Got a full schedule today. You've got a meeting with finance at... I need some reports." Devon finally glanced up. "What kind of reports?" Michael tossed his coat over the back of a chair, leaning against his desk. "Payroll data. Employee wage distribution. I want to see the breakdown across all departments." Devon frowned. "That's kind of a big ask first thing in the morning." Michael gave him a pointed look. Devon sighed. "I'll get what I can." Michael nodded and sat down, but his mind was already working ahead. He didn't know what he expected the reports to tell him. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe Sophia's situation was unique. But as the hours passed and as the data slowly trickled onto his desk, Michael's stomach tightened. It wasn't just Sophia. There were dozens of employees making barely enough to get by, names he had seen before but never really looked at, people who worked under his brand, in his offices, in his restaurants, holding everything together while he sat at the top, assuming everything was fine. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. This was a problem, a big one, and it wasn't going to fix itself. Sophia knew something was off the moment she stepped into work. People were whispering. She wasn't sure why, but there was a tension in the air, something subtle but noticeable. "Did you hear?" someone murmured near the break room. "Yeah, payroll's been going through some kind of audit. No idea why." Sophia slowed her steps. An audit? That didn't make sense. Payroll was scheduled for review once a quarter. They weren't due for another check-in for weeks. Still, she pushed the thought away. It had nothing to do with her. She made her way to her station, settling into the usual rhythm of her morning, but the unease lingered. It wasn't until lunchtime that things truly veered off course. "Hey, Sophia." She looked up, startled to find none other than Michael Turner standing in front of her desk. Her heart nearly stopped. It wasn't that she had never seen him before. Of course she had. He was the CEO. But he didn't visit. He didn't personally come down to this level of the company unless it was for something important. "Sir," she said quickly, standing. Michael motioned slightly with his head. "Walk with me." Sophia hesitated. Was this about her request? Was she in trouble? Still, she had no choice but to follow. She kept her steps even, her expression neutral as she walked beside him through the halls. The whispers followed them, employees exchanging curious glances as they passed. Finally, Michael led her into a quiet conference room, closing the door behind them. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he turned to face her. "I followed you home last night." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Her stomach dropped, a sharp spike of panic shooting through her limbs. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Michael held up a hand. "Before you say anything, I'm not here to accuse you of anything." She stared at him, barely able to process what he had just admitted. "What?" Her voice was quieter than she intended. Michael exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "I don't normally do things like that, but when you put in that request, something about it didn't sit right with me. I had to know why." Sophia felt frozen in place. Her mind screamed at her to say something, to deny, to question, to react. But Michael wasn't done. "I saw where you live," he continued, his tone quieter now. "I saw your family." Sophia flinched. A heavy silence stretched between them. Finally she found her voice. "Sir, with all due respect, that isn't your concern." Michael's eyes darkened. "It is my concern." Sophia set her jaw. "I do my job. I don't complain. I don't bring my problems here. Whatever my personal situation is, it has nothing to do with the company." Michael stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong." Sophia's fingers clenched at her sides. She didn't need this. She didn't need pity. "Sir, if this is about my request—" "I'm approving it," he interrupted. "But that's not all I'm doing." She blinked. He sighed. "Look, I get it. You don't want help. You don't want to feel like a charity case. But this isn't about just you, Sophia." She remained silent. "There are others," Michael said. "Others who are in the same position as you, people who have worked here for years but are barely scraping by. That's not the kind of company I want to run." Sophia swallowed. She wasn't sure how to respond. This wasn't what she had expected when she put in that request. She had anticipated either an approval or a rejection, not this. Not her CEO standing in front of her, looking at her like she mattered. Michael let out a breath. "I'm going to fix this, but I need to know more, if you'll let me." Sophia met his gaze. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Michael Turner was never a man who second-guessed his decisions. But as he sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the new company policy changes that bore his signature, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set something in motion that he wasn't fully prepared for. His office was silent, the distant hum of traffic below barely reaching him. The reforms were official now. Wage increases, employee food security programs, childcare assistance. Things that should have been in place long ago. And yet he had hesitated. Not because it wasn't the right thing to do, but because it meant confronting a truth he had ignored for too long. He had built an empire on the backs of hard-working people like Sophia Bennett, and never once stopped to consider if they were okay. A soft knock on his office door broke the silence. He looked up to find Sophia standing there, hesitating. She had never stepped foot into this office before. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice cautious. Michael stood, motioning for her to come in, closed the door. She did, slowly, as if wary of what was coming next. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." She hesitated, then sank into the chair, her posture guarded. She had every right to be wary. Their last conversation had been intense. Michael folded his hands on the desk. "How are you feeling about everything?" Sophia blinked, clearly caught off guard. "About what?" "The policy changes, the new benefits package, the increased wages. Your request for leftover food led to all of this, whether you meant for it to or not." Her lips parted slightly, then pressed together. "I think it's good, necessary." "But," Michael pressed. Sophia studied him. "But I don't know if it will last." Michael leaned forward slightly. "It will." "How do you know?" "Because I'll make sure of it," he said simply. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You say that now, but CEOs make promises all the time. They bring in flashy changes, and then a year later things go back to the way they were." Michael considered her words. "You think I'll forget?" Sophia held his gaze. "I think you'll move on. That's what people like you do. You make a grand gesture, you fix what's in front of you, and then you return to your world. Meanwhile, people like me, we keep struggling." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't wrong. He had seen it happen before. Hell, he had been that person before. But this was different. "I don't intend to move on," he said. "That's why I brought you here." Sophia frowned. "What do you mean?" Michael reached into his desk and slid a folder toward her. She eyed it suspiciously before opening it. Her eyes widened. "This is a promotion offer," she said slowly. Michael nodded. "It is." Sophia's breath hitched. "Head of Employee Relations?" "You have a first-hand understanding of what's broken in this company," Michael said, "and I need someone who won't let me forget. Someone who will make sure these changes stick. Someone who will fight for employees when the board tries to roll things back." Sophia stared at the papers in front of her. "I've never worked in corporate leadership before." "You don't have to," Michael said. "You just have to know the people, and you do." Her fingers traced the edge of the paper. "And you think your board is going to let me walk in and start making decisions?" Michael smirked. "They'll have to. Because you'll be reporting directly to me." Sophia looked up, something unreadable in her eyes. "Why me?" Michael leaned back, exhaling. "Because I followed you home that night, and it changed me." A silence stretched between them. Then Sophia closed the folder. "You really mean this?" she murmured. "I do." She let out a slow breath, processing. Finally she nodded. "I'll do it." Michael's shoulders loosened slightly. "Good. But I have one condition," she added. He raised a brow. "Let's hear it." Sophia's grip on the folder tightened. I want the first initiative we roll out to be direct aid to employees struggling with housing and food insecurity, not just higher wages, actual assistance. Michael considered it. Then he nodded. Done. A small, relieved smile tugged at the corner of Sophia's lips. And for the first time, Michael felt like he was truly running a company worth leading. 3 months later, the company cafeteria was louder than usual. Sophia stood near the back, watching employees take advantage of the company's new meal program. For the first time, food was available for free to any employee who needed it. No questions asked, no stigma attached. It was just one of the many changes she had helped implement. Higher wages, a food assistance program, child care reimbursement. And there was more to come. She felt someone step up beside her. "Not bad," Michael murmured, surveying the room. Sophia smirked. "It's a start." Michael nodded. "You're good at this." "Good at what?" "Fixing things." Sophia laughed. "I don't think we're there yet." Michael crossed his arms. "Maybe not. But you made me see something I had ignored for too long. That's a kind of leadership most executives never learn." Sophia glanced at him. "And what about you? Do you regret it?" Michael raised a brow. "Regret what?" "Changing," she said simply. Michael was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he said. "I only regret not seeing it sooner." Sophia's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Instead, she looked back at the employees, the people she had once stood among, struggling, unseen. Now they had a voice. Now they had a future. And so did she. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was moving forward. And she wasn't alone.